Hi all, how are things going? So we are on week 5, as you probably noticed. That means we're about halfway through the class, and it also means that we're about to get started on the big group project. And so for the rest of the quarter, you're going to be basically working on workplace writing. The next assignment is going to have you put together a short memo. The assignment after that is going to have you put together a product design document. And so I feel like before we move forward, we got to get some basic stuff about workplace writing on the page. And that's the goal here. That's the goal of this video, is to talk about some basic things that I feel like you need to know about workplace writing. So we're going to start off talking about some general principles that I think are important. We're going to move on to talk real briefly about the memo. And then when we're finished with that, we are going to look at writing in teams, writing in groups of other people, right? So that's the goal of the video here. So I want to start you off with a little scenario. So you have produced a memo for this particular gentleman here. You work for a small programming firm along with this guy. He's a really busy, overworked guy. He's tired most of the time, but he's having a particularly rough couple weeks. So first off, you can kind of tell that from this video, because he's or from this picture, because he's sleeping, right? He's got his Coke there, so he's chugging caffeine in a desperate attempt to stay awake. It looks like he just threw the shirt on here because it's got the Napster logo on it. So it's probably manufactured in like 2002 or something like that. So he threw it on real quickly before he headed to work. And of course, we're in the middle of quarantine, right? So his children are at home, right? His young toddler is running around destroying things in his house. His 7-year-old just got grounded from his Nintendo Switch. His wife is flustered because she's having to do all this homeschooling crap, right? And he went into his empty office thinking, man, I just hope maybe if I'm here in this empty office, I can get some stuff done, right? So he comes in, opens up his computer, and opens up his inbox. There's a million messages there. And the first thing he's going to do, which he's hoping to get through in the next half an hour, 45 minutes, is to catch up on his email and find out what's going on with the other team members throughout his workplace, right? So that's your scenario, right? That's the typical audience for a workplace document, right? And the thing I want you to keep in mind is that your message probably is not at the top. It's probably not at the bottom. It's buried somewhere in the center, right? So he was going to have already read through a lot of boring communications by the time he reaches your document. Does that mean some things for you, right? It means some things about how you need to produce text of this sort, right? One of them is you need to get to the point as quickly as possible, right? You don't have any time for rhetorical flourishes. You don't want to tell any fancy stories, that sort of stuff. That's just not the appropriate place for these kinds of documents, right? Also, he's probably not going to read it very carefully. He has to go through this stuff really quickly, right? And so he's having to process this information as fast as he can so he can move on with whatever important task he has to do for the day. And I know this is true for myself. It's really common for me to read emails from students or colleagues and sort of miss the point because I'm trying to scan through it real quickly. And so that's another feature of workplace writing, is that people are reading quickly and they're scanning and they're not reading something carefully like you might expect from a more academic audience, right? And so that means a few things for you. That means a few things about how you're going to format these documents, right? So first off, most workplace writing really emphasizes organization to an even larger extent than a lot of academic writing does. And so you need to really particularly pay close attention to introductory sentences of each paragraph. You need to make sure that those topic sentences declare exactly what the point is. And if they're confusing or misleading, your audience may miss what you're trying to say, right? And so you need to be really focused on the first sentence of each paragraph. Typically, for obvious reasons, workplace writers prefer smaller paragraphs over longer, unwieldy ones. It's not uncommon in workplace context to see paragraphs of 3 to 5 sentences worth of length, right? And so that's something important to keep in mind. Visual design has become really important because visual cues help people scan documents more quickly. And so especially bullet points, headings, those sorts of things, those are going to become even more important in the workplace context. You want to use concise language. You want to cut out any unnecessary words. I know that you guys are used to cramming your essays with a bunch of fluff to meet your page requirements, but in workplace writing, that's not acceptable, right? So you got to learn to strip your adjectives out, get rid of any unnecessary phrases or words, all that sort of stuff, right? And then finally, this is more of a minor formatting thing. Business documents are single-spaced, and they typically use block format. I'm going to say a couple more words about that when we look at the memo here in a second. All right, so let's talk about memos. So memos is a particular genre that are used quite frequently still. And so I want to say a few things about what they are and how they work and so forth. The first thing is when I was saying block format before, you can see a real clear illustration of that here, right? And block format basically means, if you look at this document, you can see that right here, everything is aligned on the left-hand margin, right? So instead of indenting the paragraphs, it's all aligned on the left-hand margin. And also there's a space typically between each paragraph, right? And so this is the preferred format of most business documents. So for the rest of the quarter, you should be trying to produce your documents in this way, right? Memos are kind of a strange genre because they've been largely supplanted by email. A lot of textbooks still claim that memos are informal documents, and that's because once upon a time, right, how memos were used is someone would type them out on a typewriter and hand them off to a courier, and they would bring that somewhere else, within the business, right? And so they often could be really informal in those contexts, right? But that is not the case these days, right? I think memos are typically used when a business needs to create a little more formality that isn't possible with an email, right? So when they want to create that additional formality, that additional distance, they typically use a memo for those purposes, right? So memos are often used for declaring policy changes. If there's any big policy change in a business, a memo will often be used for that. They're also used for reports, and that sort of thing. They're often done in memo format. And one thing to keep in mind is these are always internal documents. They're always designed for people within the business, and they're typically not designed for people outside of it, right? Now, if you look at the memo, the reason I say a letter by another name is still a letter, and the basic point is here, a memo is basically a letter. It's a fancy letter that is a little more formal than your typical letter document, right? And so a couple features of it that I think are prominent, right? So memos are typically distinguished by their heading block, right? And you should see this as familiar because it's really similar to the information that's required for an email. You should really especially pay close attention to the subject line. So the subject line is basically declares exactly what this particular document's about. Typically, there's a short opening segment that declares exactly what this memo is discussing. Usually it builds towards something like a thesis statement that says the main thing this memo is trying to cover, right? Then there's often a discussion section, right, where they go into more detail, provide more evidence, supply more information, so forth. The key feature of the heading section is that the discussion section is that usually has headings to distinguish between different parts, right? And so from now until the end of the quarter, get used to headings. They're a typical feature of these kinds of documents, right? And then finally, there's also typically a closing segment that has a call to action, right? So the closing segment typically tells the person, this is what I want you to do based on this information, right? And so make sure that you include that as well. Now, if you want to know more details and you want to read this particular sample yourself, I've uploaded it to GachoSpace. It's goofy like all my examples are, but I've also annotated it to give you some more information about what to include in your documents, right? So that's the memo, but the more important thing, the thing I want to talk about in a little more detail is about working in teams, right? Because your big group project is a team project, and there's a lot of hurdles to working with teams of people. And so I want to say some things about how to make the group project successful and some strategies you should use to make this work out as you move throughout the quarter, right? Oh yeah, and this picture here, I forgot to mention this. This picture is actually from Deltopia, right? So this was taken like in 2013, so before I even got here. You probably heard that Deltopia was crazy once upon a time, but you perhaps didn't understand the full extent of that. So here, this is almost like a riot you can see here, right? And I'm not sure what that gentleman there is doing, but it appears he's about to get batoned by a police officer, right? And so if you're wondering why they throw up big fences and things like that every year in Isla Vista, that is the reason for that, right? That we don't want to repeat of those situations, right? So anyway, if you're missing Deltopia, just be thankful that you didn't get beat up by police officers, right? Okay, anyway, so on to some team strategy, organization strategies to avoid, right? So the most important one, and the strategy that should be avoided at all costs, is what I like to call the dictator, right? And the dictator is like where one person sort of takes charge but instead of sort of soliciting feedback from all the other group members, they tend to ignore other people's advice and sort of plow forward and do everything by themselves, right? And I've had numerous experiences with people doing this sort of thing, and it's always frustrating, right? There's nothing more frustrating than having spent your time doing a whole bunch of work and sending it to someone and then just have them completely redo it because they feel like whatever you did is problematic, right? And so you probably are going to need a leader in your teams, right? Somebody who's going to take charge and set due dates and that sort of thing. So I'm not saying there shouldn't be some form of leadership in the team itself, right? But one person can't do an entire 15 to 20 page project, right? And so make sure that you're collaborating with your other group members, soliciting their feedback, and assigning realistic tasks to everybody so everybody can contribute in some way, right? The other strategy that doesn't work very often is what I call face-to-face, which is something obviously you can't do. You're obviously not going to be meeting face-to-face. But this includes, things like, a collaborative discussion meeting, or Zoom discussion meetings, or something along these lines, right? And the reason this doesn't work is because most tasks that require writing are typically solitary endeavors, right? So a group of people can't collaboratively work on a document at the same time. It just doesn't work that way, right? And so you need to have moments where people go off on their own, do their individual task, and then bring it to the group for additional feedback, right? And so that approach where everybody's collaboratively working on the document at the same time isn't typically effective. And I think that includes like doing stuff in Google Documents, right? I've had experiences where I've tried to like work on things with Google Documents while another person's working, and it could be just complete chaos with one person writing up here, another person writing down here. Just not a useful approach to doing this sort of thing, right? And then lastly, the divided approach doesn't really work either, right? And so it doesn't work for like you to say, person A, you're going to do this task, person D, you're going to do this task, person C, you're going to do this task, and just throw it together right before the due date. And the problem with that is because what you're going to end up with is something that seems like 4 or 5 different projects, right? There isn't going to be a coherent style. It may have long paragraphs in one section and short little bitty ones in another section, so on and so forth, right? So you can't do everything separately. You also need to have moments where you come together and review the material, right? So what I prefer is what I call the layered approach, right? And this is basically where you have a group leader that assigns people different tasks, and then periodically you come together to evaluate where you're at, right? And so the way this works is like, so one person might draft the marketing section. Another person might add some graphs and tables. Some person might make revisions to the graphic design, right? And then you got a group meeting where you come together, evaluate where you're at, and then redistribute your tasks, right? And then it continues to work like that, with you working on things separately and then coming together periodically to reevaluate, right? And so I think that's the best approach to group projects, right? So successful groups have leaders that set clear deadlines, schedule meetings, deal directly with conflict. They listen to criticism and make decisions together. They have a higher proportion of teammates that are actively working on the project, while crap groups have members that are always asking the leaders what they should be doing, pretend conflict doesn't exist. They have little teeny subgroups that make decisions and tell everybody else what to do, like dictators, right? And they have smaller people that are actively involved, right? And so if you feel like you're falling on the right side of this document, right, then you should be emailing me to figure out what we can do to make your group work out more successfully, right? Now, as a final thing, I think it's really important for you guys to implement a project management system, right? And this is just so people know what the hell is going on, right? And there are lots of different ways to do project management. One is through a sort of simple task list where you have, who's working on something, you have the task they're working on, and then the deadline which they have to complete it. So that's like the simplest way to do that. But I really recommend using a piece of project management software, right? And I think they tend to be really useful and really useful for working on these kinds of projects, right? One that's really popular in the workplace now is called Trello, right? And so I'm going to go ahead and show you what this looks like here real quick. Let me go ahead and log in here. Log in with Google. Hopefully my Google account pulls this up automatically. And so you can see here I have an example of a writing project that other students have worked on before, right? And the way they set it up, they had a to-do section, right, where they had this sort of list of things that are only list of things to do. Then they had a due date section, and then they had a list of things that were completed, right? And so you can see the cool thing about Trello is it lets you create these cards under these lists, right? And so you can sort of drag things around real easily. It also lets you attach documents, right? So you can see this person attached a link to a Google Drive account. You can also assign team members to different things, right? So you can see here there's a list of members, and I can take these and sort of drag them onto the document as people go and work. So I really recommend you try something like this out. That you give you have some sort of team management software that you use to manage your situation, right? So just as a final note, I would like you to share whatever kind of team management approach that you're taking. So if you're just doing a task list on Google Documents, you can share that with me. If you want to use something like Trello, you can just add me to the list of people, and just so I can check in on you guys on a regular basis and figure out what's going on, right? So choose some sort of project management solution, and then share whatever that solution is with me, so I can keep tabs on how the work is going. All right, so that's it for the video today. Next class period, we are going to look at engineering research, and so I will see you then.